It's my pleasure to present Robert Jesinger, who will give us a presentation on so-called dollars and the William H. Warner and Brother Company of Philadelphia. Just one brother. I noticed that. So, Robert, take it away.
Okay. All right. So I wanted to kind of give a little bit of background in terms of why this talk came into being. I'm a so-called dollar collector, historical metal collector, and Bill Hyder gave a really interesting talk several years ago about why I collect, meaning why people collect. And as I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of background on this, because I think that how I got to this talk is sort of interesting, just to kind of spend a minute telling you at the beginning. So as I was growing up, I used to collect commemorative medals. And then around the 2007 timeframe, I ran across the PPIE so-called dollar medal series and kind of found myself migrating into collecting so-called dollars, which I've been doing ever since about 2007. And I think with a lot of things in collecting, there's the collect a variety of things. And then there comes reflection about, what do I have and, who made it. Clearly, this is backwards from the teaching of buy the book, then buy the coin. But I think that some of us also see certain styles of metals or coins and kind of get hooked in terms of collecting along those styles. I've always found the so-called dollar series interesting because of the artistry and the skill. I never quite knew why until as I was putting together this talk, which I'll explain in detail. And I was not aware of all the variations of metal variations of the metals, such as gold, silver, bronze, white metals when I first started collecting, but that's something that becomes apparent as you collect these historical metals. Nor was I really aware that you could do research like folks have done with regard to auction appearances and learning along those lines. To be honest, when I first started collecting, I started collecting based upon where I had lived or interest in things. So being out in the San Francisco Bay Area, collecting PPIE was interesting to me. I also lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I collect Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania here in Brothers Metals. And this talk kind of comes out of the fact that for years I've told people that the area that I collect in so-called dollars is part two. And part two, if you look at the original Hibbler and Kaplan book, it was divided into three sections. Part one was a section on major expositions, where those metals really were made by mint folks. Names like Key and Soley come up. Part two is a little bit more nebulous. It's all the smaller fairs, accessory metals. And then part three are things along the lines of metals related to money, like lesser dollars. So there's this section of part two is a little bit of a complicated section of so-called dollar collecting. But as I've kind of collected a lot of the metals in that section, I've gotten the sense that the artistry in those metals ties into the first section very much. And I have this kind of conjecture that these metals were kind of the extra metals made, call it the moonlighting job, the gig economy, as it were, for folks who worked at the mint or designed metals that were struck at the mint. Dick Johnson, who passed away recently, has a website that kind of parallels a lot of this. And as I kind of move forward through the slides, I'm going to talk about the various aspects of this. So the title of the talk is So-Called Dollars and the William H. Warner and Brother Company. So I've kind of already alluded to this. What's the purpose of this talk? To learn about so-called dollars that were made or that are associated with that company. But a kind of a major, in order to accomplish that first goal or that first purpose, I think what you have to begin to sort of look at are the patterns of artistry and style of metals that were made between roughly about 1880 and 1900. I have 1870 on here because I need to start there as we kind of segue forward. But names like Key, Soley, Robert Leverett Jr., a name that you may not have heard of, Kretschmann, these are names that kind of were very active in this time, at least up until about 1880. And hanging out with all the so-called guys who collect so-called dollars, they're very much as a push to collect things from the 1860s to the 1880s, because you have some really famous names at the mint, making some really great medals. It's a much harder to try to figure out who made what between about 1880 and 1900. Um, you're going to see in this talk some unlisted so-called dollars. One of the talks that I thought was very interesting in my Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania collecting area was a talk given at the ANA in Pittsburgh, where the gentleman giving the talk basically spent 20 minutes up front explaining the purpose of what he was about to do. And then he went coin by coin by coin, or metal by metal by metal, where he must have gone through 50 and said, all of these are made by the Huron Brothers Jewelers of Pittsburgh. And there'll be a little bit of that in this talk too. And then I'm going to comment as we kind of go through on areas where I think I know this is true, so fact, and then I don't really know, but I speculate and conjecture. So keep me honest. I'm going to try to tell you what I know and what I don't know. I will tell you there's a lot that we don't know about the Warner Company. One other thing I wanted to mention to give credit where credit's due. John Raymond, who has the website that includes a lot of unlisted so-called dollars, gave a talk in 2017 at the so-called gathering, where he basically spent a lot of time talking about the style and the artistry of metals that he thinks came from the Warner Company. And so some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight is really credit to John, but he spent quite a while talking about one particular aspect of the metals, which are the denticles around the edge. I'm not going to talk much about the denticles tonight. I think it's an interesting area, but I kind of want to try to convince you of the parallels, what metals may have come from the Philadephia area, what metals I think were made by Warner, and work my way from there. So a little bit of background. If one starts to go down the road of the name, Warner, the first name you run across is John Warner. And John Warner was a medalist in Philadelphia from about the 1840s to the 1860s. And as you can see from this advertisement, he was at 326 Chestnut in Philly. And he made a variety of things. Clearly, he had some background in jewelry, but he made badges and medals in gold, silver, bronze, and white metal for a variety of things: colleges, churches, religious societies. Philadephia at that time, of course, was a major place for metal and coin production because of the Philadelphia Mint. You can figure that, I have a regular job, but I also work on the side in the gig economy and have things that I do. There's, according to Dick Johnson, there's very much kind of a speculation that a lot of the folks who were associated with the Mint, worked on the side, or they would engrave things and have them struck at the Mint because the Mint had the major presses of the day. If you go to the Numismatist, there is a few pages in the December 1905 Numismatist that talk about Charles K. Warner. Charles was the son of John Warner, again, the previous page, and John Warner was alive from about 1823 to 1868, only 45 years, really, kind of a short life by today's standards. And about 1868 is when Charles Warner kind of began his business, shall we say. And I don't collect Civil War tokens or Civil War store cards, but I imagine there's a great many people who do. But the entry into the Warner family in terms of being able to collect a medal that I could find initially are the Charles Warner store cards. And again, these store cards are describing his business, and they're around the time of the Civil War. So it's not unusual to see the Union emphasized, long wave the flag, as you can kind of see. Interestingly enough, Charles Warner, I think, and this is speculation, spent quite a bit more time selling and buying and trading than actually making medals. It's pretty clear from this numismatist article that his store cards were made by Key and Robert Leverett Jr. And both William Key and Robert Leverett Jr. were engravers in Philadelphia. And I think their major time at which they were working was for at least for Robert Lever Jr. was from about the 1840s to the 1870s. And for Key, really, he was very busy from about 1860 to, let's say, 1885. Or you could cut it short and say 1880. But both Key and Robert Leverett Jr. were pretty much done, shall we say, by about 1880. And so a lot of the Warner medals that we're going to see are really 1876, 1880 through about 1900. But this is a kind of a store card from quite a bit earlier. And it just kind of, I think one of the things that's important to know too is that there definitely was an association between Charles Warner, him knowing folks like Key and Lovett, and probably Soley. And very much, he grew up in a family where his father, John Warner, knew people at the Philly Mint. And there are several kind of ties to that I'm going to show here in just a moment. I kind of thought that nobody would be interested in collecting Charles Warner store cards, and boy, was I wrong. In 2019, the bidding was fast and furious on this Warner store card in the Baker collection. And I'm not 100% sure why folks collect Charles Warner store cards, but they seem to be expensive, and bidding goes pretty high. I'd like to kind of know who's buying them, but my guess is it's probably Civil War token collector folks who have an interest in this. This particular medal was in silver and engraved by Key. Again, kind of the connection to the mint and the engravers. Charles was busy, not making medals, but here is an example of his cataloging of medals of Louis Breckeman, who was a jeweler in Philadephia. And this sale occurred in 1867. And Breckeman, he collected quite a large variety of medals. And this is in particular his colonial collection, Washingtonia and Patterns, cataloged by Charles Warner. Bill Hyder and I had talked about this little section in the Numismatist. This is a reminiscence of Charles Warner later in his life. And what's interesting about this, and clearly there's too many words on here to read, but what's interesting is as a kid, he hung out at the US Mint. And one part on here I think is interesting. So his father, John Warner, who was in Philadephia, knew a silversmith, William Sellers, in the old Mint building. And Sellers had occupied the majority of the first floor of the US Mint building. And Warner basically acquired a whole bunch of old dies from the Mint. So that's fact, but what those dies were is a little bit more kind of speculation. But very much I think that Charles Warner had the interest in having dies and using those dies and striking those dies and selling a product. It's not unlike, our friend, Jeff Shevelin, who just struck 2020, not exactly restrikes, but him and basically striking the Wilson dollar. It generates a lot of interest, and it's kind of a cool restrike of an historically important metal. Anyway, Charles Warner said in this article, as a lad, I frequently visited the old Mint building, played there, but I had no interest in what was going on in there. But he certainly did. He certainly did later in life. So what are the things we kind of know about the Warner family? Well, Charles and his brother, William, appear to have gone into business together. And they were associated from about 1868 to 1899 after their dad died. And their business was the W.H. Warner and Brother Company. It's important to know that the brother is Charles K. Warner, the medalist and numismatist. But I don't think Charles struck anything, but he must have had the business knack for doing the deals, shall we say. There's really not a lot known about William. I have a subscription to newspapers.com, and I've been digging in the middle of this COVID pandemic for months and just have not really found a whole lot. And it's kind of fascinating when, he features so prominently in the so-called, in the so-called dollar series, but very little can be found about him. Charles, his brother, of course, was born in 1845, died, I'm thinking around 1919, 1920. It's difficult to find an exact date for him, but I'm pretty sure about the birth dates on both Charles and William from looking through records. And as I mentioned, Charles was a numismatist and coin dealer in Philly at 326 Chestnut. It's also interesting to trace the locations he was at. He started out at 326 Chestnut, and then around 1870, he moved to 728 Chestnut. That's fact. It's in the numismatist. And at some point, by about the mid 1880s, he moved down Chestnut Street to 1126, assuming that he moved and the streets weren't renumbered, which is something that does happen quite a bit in cities. His brother William, I speculate he was the engraver, the jeweler in the business, but I can't find a whole lot on him. I can't find a picture, for example. But it's clear that under the umbrella of these two gentlemen that they were fairly active up until about 1900. I have speculations of what I think what metals William Warner made, because you have to realize Charles Warner, the business that they were in, they had access to a great many dies, and I think dies were swapped around among different engravers. And so a lot of metals are made, in that way through the Warner Company. I'm not quite sure that I know they had a lot of dies. I think that they certainly made some things uniquely for themselves, but I have a feeling that a lot of the metals that they made various parts of it were from, pre-made dies. And as a matter of fact, as we look through some of their metals, I'm going to try to point out the similarities among them. That whole second part of the so-called dollar book, most of those metals, nobody describes who made them. But I think a great many of them were made by the William Warner and Brother Company. And I'm going to try to weave that together. We talked about Warner store cards between 1862 and 1870. What's also interesting is Deal was listed also at 728 Chestnut at the exact same place that Warner was at. And so I have a feeling that Warner and Deal and Key and Soley, all these folks knew each other. It was a small world in Philadelphia at that time. And I'm certain that there are probably connections to the famous folks like George Morgan, as we'll see. So if you're a so-called dollar collector like me and you foray into the 1876 Centennial Expo, it becomes sort of apparent that there are two classic dies, two classic kind of designs in the 1876 Centennial Expo. And those are these, the Liberty Bell created by or engraved by Key, thought to be struck and issued by Deal. And then the Soley engraving of George Washington. And Jeff Shevlin and Bill, I don't know if I assume you're on this. I know that Jeff is this year's Mega Red section on so-called dollars is going to talk a great deal about the 1876 Centennial Expo. So you might want to, if you're interested in this particular expo, there will be more coming out on that. I don't collect 1876 Centennial Expo. I keep telling folks I don't, and yet I seem to have pieces from it that are like these. Now here's another interesting turn. HK29, which is a metal listed under the Centennial Expo, you get the sense from looking in the so-called dollar book that it was maybe made by Key. But I don't think anybody really knows who exactly made this metal, which is one side is a Liberty Bell and the other side is Independence Hall. There's no markings on this metal to specify who made it. It certainly was sold in the 1880s by Warner. As you see on the right-hand side there, it comes in a Warner box, but it also comes in a John Klein box, who was another medalist in Philadelphia at that time. So it's speculation, but I think Jeff had told me he thinks that this medal was maybe made by Klein. I have no idea who really made this, because I can't find, for sure. But I told somebody once that I really don't like this metal because I think artistically and stylistically, it's not as good as the others. Um, so I put down here Soli because I told Bill Hyder one time I don't like Soli's metals. I think they're very drab. Some people love Soli metals, but having looked through them, I don't really like them artistically for what it's worth. And that's not me trying to speak ill will of George Soli. But he worked through the Philadephia Mint. And I think stylistically, this metal might be his, but it's speculation. Soli also worked with other Philadephia metalists like Key and William Warner. Anyway, so turning to what I've already kind of mentioned, Dick Johnson has a website about, he was the historian for the Medallic Art Company. And in reading through his website in 2011, he had an entry about Philadephia engravers. And the gist of what he was saying, because he was into, of course, he was selling metals and researching metals. And he has a great website for what it's worth on the initials, wonderful website where you can look up the initials you find on a metal, and the website will tell you who made it. So I find that a fascinating research tool. But getting back to the point of this slide, if you look at this bronze medal in the lower corner, this is an example of what he was talking about with regard to the Philadephia style of metals. Typically, there's an engraving in the center of the obverse and lettering around the edge. And on the reverse, there's usually more lettering, something like a wreath and dates. And in the lower right-hand corner, there's the Souvenir Die. You'll notice that the wreaths have, they're the same. And you could imagine a situation where somebody had a die or a hub for that wreath where they could put the lettering, engrave the lettering, or punch the lettering onto a die, and then strike it, but always reusing that wreath. For me, there's probably 3 different types of wreaths that are common patterns that occur again and again and again on so-called dollars, and in that section 2 of the book. This particular style, John Raymond has talked about, Dick Johnson has talked about, and I kind of, if you have any interest in so-called dollars, this kind of style for me is sort of a Philadephia style. Now, in all fairness, we're all sitting out here in California, and I thought, how in the world can I give a talk to the Pacific Coast Numismatic Society and be talking about, Philadelphia, maybe New York, Boston, things like that. There is a connection. It's at the end of the talk, so I'll keep you in suspense. But unlike all the cool West Coast metals, this is a talk about Philadephia and East Coast metals, but it's not just to talk about the Northeast, it's talk about the South, as I'll kind of point out in just a minute. If you kind of go forward, this HK 625, Asheville, kind of a rare so-called dollar. Notice the wreath, notice the lettering, notice the style on the obverse. There are a great many metals made between 1880 and 1900 that have the same pattern repeated again and again and again. And I think for me, this pattern, this lettering, the font of the lettering, I think all of this comes out of Philadephia, and I think a great many of these metals that are not attributed in the so-called dollar books are all from William Warner and Company. Now, that doesn't say that William Warner himself engraved every single one of these, but I think a great many of these were from the Warner Company. And I think that's somewhat new because Warner isn't really, how shall we say, like, it gets talked about here and there, but I think that there's a lot of work that could be done and discovered in this area. Now, I mentioned here also on the right-hand side of the slide, this is a little bit of background about Key, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of. But again, at the bottom here, Warner acquired many of Key's dies. Key kind of got out of the business, let's say 1883, 1885. And from research, Warner had many of those Key dies and struck them on his own. And you might look at this and say, well, gee whiz, the Warner Company was just some big, marketing company that stamped things out and, they didn't like have any talent in their organization. But I think that they did. I think though that there was a great many of the dies swapping, a great many of subcontracting going out to the engravers. And again, I think that Charles was probably the brains of the operation in terms of going and getting contracts for things like even this little North Carolina medal, for example. If you flip open the so-called dollar book and you start looking up Warner, one of the first things you'll probably find in the index is the Battle of Bennington monument medal. Again, if you look at the lettering on the reverse here, kind of the style, it's very similar to the North Carolina piece, very similar to some of the unlisted so-called dollars. And again, this is attributed to William Warner. So I feel like if you look at this lettering, if you look at this style, you're going to see, it doesn't have a reef, but you're going to see stylistically there, it gets repeated again and again and again. And again, their company was active from about 1868 to, I put 1899. They pretty much, I think, probably went out of business around 1902. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more. Some dates that are of interest is, again, most of the Warner medals are the 1880 to 1900 range. Robert Leverett Jr. closed about 1879, and William Key left the mint at about 1885 at the age of 55. And so there's this, the focus of where we're going is there's a lot of cool stuff between 1860 and 1880, but I feel like the 1880 to 1900 era was the Warner Company era in, in terms of a lot of these medals. Just for what it's worth, Colonel Seth Warner was a Revolutionary War hero. Kind of one of the seminal battles in the Revolutionary War occurred in Vermont. And interestingly enough, this statue, nobody really knows what Seth Warner actually looked like. There are no likenesses. This is kind of a fantasy statue. Nobody really has his picture. But the William Warner and Charles Warner are descendants of Colonel Seth Warner, who fought in the Revolutionary War. So I just kind of put that up there for what that's worth. And this is from the Battle of Bennington, when this large monument was put up. Of course, a lot of these medals are fundraising tools, this was struck and issued for that, both as a fundraising tool and as a as a souvenir, shall we say, of the event. So jumping back up, as you start to look through so-called dollars, the first time you kind of run across William Warner is in about 1883. And again, by about the early 1880s, Robert Leverett Jr. had passed away and Key was sort of on his way out. And so we see in this catalog the German-American Bicentennial Medal of 1883. This medal is, a nice so-called dollar, in my opinion. It's got stylistically some similarities to what we talked about with the Warner Company. On the right, if you flip through the Rouleau book, you'll find that there are some smaller partner medals that go with this. And here's an example of one of the smaller medals. And again, in the Journal of Numismatics, October 83, it's attributed to Warner. I also look at this medal and I think to myself, that's probably made by William Warner. It's not very good. I don't mean to sound bad. It's okay. But this medal back here, HK 596, is a very nice medal. The engraving work on that is impressive to me. And here are some parallel medals that we've already mentioned. On the right is the Germantown medal. Interestingly enough, in Steigerwalt's Coin Journal, these medals are mentioned that both of them come from the Warner Company. And again, I look at the one on the left from the Southern Exposition of 1883 in Louisville, which was a recurrent exposition over many years. And I really like that design and that medal. And Fred Hollibird sold one of these in 2013. Some lucky person has that. The one on the right is okay. Now, the question then comes up, well, if the Germantown medal is attributed to Warner, yet there are no marks on that medal to say who engraved it, who engraved it? who made it. I think speculation is that probably this work was subcontracted out. Now, interestingly enough, at last year's so-called dollar gathering, I kind of had an interesting discovery that I talked to the group about there. And I'll share that again here tonight. The medal on the right is the obverse of another so-called dollar called the St. Louis 26th anniversary. And I believe, and of course this is speculation, that these two medals look very much similar stylistically. The nose of the design, the the Phrygian cap at the back, the neckline. I think if you look at these, I think these probably were made by the same engraver. Don't have proof. It would be nice to know who engraved the medal on the right. The denticles around the edge, they're not exactly the same, but I think under a glass, they're not that far off because they're kind of a dot and a dash and a dot and a dash, even though it doesn't perfectly show it on the medal on the left. So again, it'd be nice to know who made that obverse, even though there isn't any, there's no baker's mark on the medal on the right. Now, interestingly enough, that obverse is paired with a large number of reverses, and all of these are 35 millimeter, about, so-called dollar size medals. And what we have here are pictures of the 1883 Southern Expo, this St. Louis medal, which is the second one down on the left, Providence, Rhode Island, bicentennial in 86, an 86 Minneapolis Expo piece. Jonathan Brescher gave me the picture of the Springfield. And then there's an unlisted so-called dollar to be listed in Jeff and Bill's new book in the lower right from Jacksonville for the Florida subtropical. So about a year ago, I was sitting there at the kitchen table and I thought, I'll look at some so-called dollars under a 10 power. And I was just looking around. And I discovered the initials EAK on both the Minneapolis reverse and on HK 607. And I scratched my head and I said, I wonder who that is. And I looked in the catalog and there's nothing in the HK book about EAK initials on any of these pieces. And so I was looking and I started looking around, and thanks to Dick Johnson, I found who this was in his website. And this is a guy named Edward Kretschmann, born in Germany in 1849, moved to America, and he was in Philadephia doing sculpture work. And the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the regiments, the Pennsylvania 114th, there's a statue to them at Gettysburg National Monument in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And he is the sculptor who made the soldier at the top. And I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but the Zouave is kind of almost a Turkish type reference to these soldiers who had these kind of baggy pants and flamboyant uniforms. And they served. It was a regiment in the Civil War, and he's tied to that statue. Now, if you go on newspapers.com, you'll find him listed in Philly, advertising for a variety of things for his work. And in 1879, he has a medal, and in 1884, he has another, and here they are. So he was definitely in the business of engraving, sculpting, and he was an artist who was winning awards. And given the fact that his initials are on several so-called dollars that are tied to the William Warner Company, my suspicion is he probably worked for them, or they gave him work, and he designed, he engraved many of the dies for them. Now, you might think the story of EAK is sort of done, and I don't know how this happened, but again, I was sitting at the kitchen table one night looking at something, and I was looking at the 1884-85 New Orleans World's Fair, Industrial and Cotton Centennial Expo. And again, this is not described in any of the books, but I found EAK on the obverse there. And this is actually a unlisted Mexican medal. So I started looking around, and it turns out that he is on practically all of these 1884, 1885 so-called dollars. And so I spent some time digging around. And if you're into Washingtonia, like Neil Musmonte's book, one of his entries, GW 1104, which is from the New York City 1889 centennial of Washington inauguration, that was also has EAK on it and was made by Kreutzmann. So again, I kind of go back to what I've already said. I think that Charles Warner wasn't engraving anything. Some of the better engraving work that was marketed or struck, let's say, by the Warner Company, at least several of their medals are from Kreutzmann. And there's another connection here. This was for sale at the 1884 New Orleans Expo. This is one of the dies, one of the so-called dollars in a Warner box. So definitely they were marketing these. And I think because the Liberty Bell was loaned to the New Orleans Expo, these were struck to go along with it. And this comes in a variant where when the Liberty Bell went to New Orleans, there's a medal. And when the Liberty Bell came back from New Orleans, there's a medal. And as you can imagine, bad feelings in the Civil War, the loaning of the Liberty Bell was a big, big deal, to loan to the South. I find it interesting they made a medal saying it came back, like it wasn't going to come back. I don't know. But in any event, this is also marketed by Warner. If you're into the first section of so-called dollars, the more official medals, you're going to find medals like this that were made by George Morgan. I kind of got carried away with myself and I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if everything was made by Warner, but clearly not. But again, this was struck at the Philadephia Mint. And many thanks again to Bill Hyder for pointing out this book, the private sketchbook of George T. Morgan, because it shows a lot of his designs and this is in there. Now, what's interesting is that the obverse of this medal can be found, interestingly enough, paired with other medals in several years forward from that, from the 1884 Expo to the 1885 St. Louis and Louisville Expos. So I think that Warner may very well have had the die to create the obverse on these. Okay, again, this work is really nice. If you were watching the Stax auction today, things like this were going for a lot of money. A lot of the work in the 1880s at the U.S. Mint, of course, were the Assay Medals. And there was a huge collection of Assay Medals sold today by Stax here in March 21. This is also a medal attributed to Warner. This is in the book on all the medals of Massachusetts, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but this was also attributed to Warner. And interestingly enough, again, this work is quite nice, but again, it kind of has maybe some of that stylistic feel of central design on the obverse, lettering, and then something on the reverse. Interestingly enough, this wreath on the back, I'll get to it in just a second, but I think it was a wreath that was made by Anthony Paquette, who of course is one of the big famous names in the Philadephia Mint in the the 1870s to 1880s era. And this wreath is one of the wreaths that I think you should pay attention to, because you're going to see that wreath on at least 4 or 5 other medals coming up. Now, one of the facts and not speculation that's important in all of this is the discovery, and it's not really a discovery, it's in the TAMS journal, but TAMS published in October of '99 a catalog from Dave Bowers of Warner medals. And this catalog probably has at least 80, 90 entries. And this was a sales catalog from the Warner and Brother company in 1902, selling medals that they had. And I speculate that if they had them, they probably had the dies, and they probably somehow made them. That's speculation because is it possible that, some of the metals that they were marketing were made by somebody else, like Key, for example? Yes. Do I think that they were selling straight US Mint products? Probably not. But this catalog has some interesting, I guess what I want to say is, as we kind of go through some of these, what I want you to do is look at the metal and say, do I think that's kind of a US Mint type metal, really good design, or is it more kind of your average engraving work? And again, this is the parallel to that A&A talk on the Heron brothers, and I kind of want to run through a few of these to try to give you a feel. So yes, one of the first, and these are in order of year. So here we are. This is for sale by the William Warner Company. And here is a medal that was engraved by Key and Lovett from the 1876 Centennial Expo. So why was Warner selling this? I don't think he made it, but this is one of the first medals in, in terms of year that you could purchase from the William Warner Company. Here's another one, which we're going to get to. And actually, I'm just going to go one page forward and then come one page back. This medal is for sale in the catalog. It's medal number 9. And it's the 1883 evacuation of New York, meaning the British got kicked out of New York in 1883. And this is a medal that is marketed by Warner. Now, what's the backstory on this medal? Well, a couple of things. That's beautiful engraving work on the obverse, and the wreath on the reverse, again, may be Anthony Paquette. So if you back up one, it's a Baker 459 medal. And in Rouleau's book, it references by William Warner and Brother. And what's interesting is the details on this from Rouleau's catalog, which specifies that the portrait of Washington was from the French Houdon sculpture, but that was thought to be from an original hub by Charles Cushing Wright. Now, Neil Musante has a 1-hour talk online that's interesting to watch. It's a video talk entirely on Charles Cushing Wright. That I think was from I want to say it was from the 18 ANA. Anyway, it's a wonderful talk. You should, if you would really enjoy watching this on online. You just Google, Neil Musante ANA 2018, I think, or Charles Cushing Wright. But interestingly enough, Warner acquired the hub, or at least this is how the story goes, had the dies made for the obverse, which was a design of Charles Cushing Wright. And then the reverse wreath is attributed to Anthony Paquette. So here you have amazing engravers, amazing dies struck and sold by Warner in Philadelphia. And is it possible that, this metal was struck at the Mint? It's possible, but again, it's being sold and marketed by Warner. On the right is a medal that's attributed to Morgan and Deal that is not sold by Warner per se, but could have been in terms of the connections here. And just for reference, Paquette died in 1882, and yet that wreath that was engraved by him probably is on a great many other Warner medals. So this is for sale by Warner here. This, which is a fairly well-known so-called dollar, HK 145, the Washington Monument. I should call it the Washington Monument Completion Medal, because in 1848, there is another so-called dollar. Well, I probably shouldn't call it a so-called dollar. There's a wonderful medal made for fundraising for the Washington Monument that usually is collected by folks who collect Washingtonia. And it's in Neil's book. But again, really nice engraving work here. Here is another medal sold and marketed by Warner. I don't think it's referenced as Warner in the HK and the so-called dollar collectors. But again, it's got that style of Philadephia, kind of a central obverse with lettering around the edge. And again, that wreath that you see on the reverse is on a great many other so-called dollars from that series, but it's not the Anthony Paquette type wreath. Here's an interesting one. This is if you're into Triennial Conclave Knights Templar medals. This is a rabbit's hole that if you go down, I don't know if you're coming back out. But again, it's very stylistically similar to Warner. I think this was probably made by William or an engraver who made a lot of this kind of particular style. If you pay attention to the lettering on the obverse on the edge, just kind of get a feel for what that style of lettering looks like. Small Washington, D.C. at the bottom. We're not going to count denticles on the edge or anything like that. But again, stylistically, how it looks. Again, I've searched this metal carefully. There's no engraver's initials anywhere, which is not necessarily, uncommon. But we're gonna see this style again and again and again in the Warner catalog. Before we get to that, we're jumping back and forth between styles. This was also for sale, but again, this has much more of a high level of engraving work feel. I don't know exactly who made this metal tonight. I can't say for sure, but it certainly has a feel of the kind of the Keys, the Lovitz type. Maybe even Philly Mint. Jumping back, again, this has much more of a feel of the kind of work coming out of the William Warner Company. Wreaths on the back, the lettering is all very similar. There's kind of a central obverse engraving. And again, John Raymond and I talked about this. He feels that all of these are Warner medals as well. Here are more. The medal on the bottom kind of ties into the second part of the so-called dollar book. There's in 1892 a fair in Augusta, sort of similar. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but John in his talk spent quite a while talking about the Heidemann Company in San Antonio. And there's an offshoot of this whole story that connects to metal engraving in Texas that I'm not going to get into because I haven't researched it as much as John Raymond has. Continuing down the road, look at these medals, the wreath on the back, the lettering stylistically, all again speaks of the William Warner Company. Same sort of thing. And I'm not spending a lot of time on each slide because what I want you to sort of take away from this is, it's almost like all the die marriages, kind of connect, or at least I feel like stylistically they connect to Philadephia, they connect to the Warner Company. And in fact, here, this particular medal is attributed to Warner and Brother in 1892 in one of the journals. And of course, here's how could Warner have not made the Battle of Bennington medal? I think they did. And again, stylistically, it feels like it fits together. Now, we jump back. I almost feel like I'm jumping back between like William Warner's type work and then almost like the higher level Key, Soley, Mint type work. This is in the so-called dollar book. I used to live in Pittsburgh. I visited the statue. It's right near the Pittsburgh Steelers Stadium, right across. It's in Allegheny Park. So if you're ever in Pittsburgh and you're going to the Steelers, you can take a walk and you can visit this George Washington statue across the river, across the Mon. What's interesting is to look at this and see, again, stylistically, if you look at that obverse, again, it kind of feels like a Warner medal in terms of the lettering, in terms of the theme. It feels like it's Philadephia. And it was in the Warner catalog for sale by Warner. Again, none of the so-called dollar book says who made this medal. And then this is kind of one of the more interesting things that ties into Warner, and that is Warner in the Mint, is this Souvenir Die. I wish I had that die. It's got beautiful souvenir written on it. It's got that Paquette type wreath. And then the obverse is paired with, again, this Allegheny Park statue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, has that feel for William Warner. But interestingly enough, there are also the exact same die paired with something that feels a little bit more higher level in terms of its engraving. And that is from the Cotton States Expo of Atlanta in '95. But I think these are all connected by die marriages. It's possible, I don't know for sure, that the Cotton States piece on the bottom was made by Warner. I suspect it was, but I don't have proof that it was. Here are some other medals. a Sons of St. George Jubilee in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I have the top medal in bronze with the souvenir reverse that I picked up at, I don't know, Long Beach one time. Anyway, I feel like it's Warner in terms of the style again. And this is not talked about in the so-called dollar book, but the Bunker Hill, again, it's like you have the cat wreath on both sides. It's got this feel, again, because of the die marriages, that it's probably tied to the William Warner Company. Here's another medal, again, Warner style. This is from the South. One of the things I was going to tell you that I would tell you is that here they are in Philadelphia, yet clearly somebody like Charles Warner had the contract or was connected into these expos in the South, New Orleans. It feels like that Warner also was connected into a lot of the Southern veterans groups and was making medals for them. And this is for sale in the Warner catalog, again, from the Q. Dave Bowers loan to TAMS for republication. Here's more, again, wreaths style. This is, again, I think tied to William Warner. And then there's something weird like this that doesn't even think it should be related to Warner. And who knows if Warner even made this? I don't know. Stylistically, it's just sort of totally different, but it's for sale in the Warner catalog. So there's curveballs. This again feels like Warner. The style, the lettering, it's a Philadephia medal. Feels like Warner was probably involved in the 1892-93 Expo there in Chicago, but then again, probably who wasn't, right? Here's a piece that is for sale in the Warner catalog. And again, it's a Soli. But again, Soli was working for Warner. It's in the literature. This is maybe an unlisted so-called dollar. I was shocked to find this in the catalog. How in the world this piece fits in? This is the Tennessee Expo of 1896. But they again, there's the wreath. And it's in the catalog. Again, not sure exactly who would have done all the engraving work on this because a lot of this is unsigned. Back to the South, here's Stonewall Camp, Confederate veterans. And this medal has a long, interesting story that Billy Gribble knows, and I'm not going to tell the whole story here, but this was kind of the start of the Confederate veterans, an organization called Stonewall Camp, and it's the idea that, where people would gather, they would call it like Lee's Camp or Grant's Camp. In terms of the general, Stonewall Camp is the idea that people are associated with Stonewall Jackson. It was their organization. And this medal is for sale through the catalog from Warner. But again, the engraving work feels a little bit more higher level, maybe through an engraver other than William Warner. This is in the catalog in 1895, Lewiston, Maine, centennial piece. Notice the wreath on the back. This kind of feels more like your standard Warner medal. Another one, this is a 1896, similar kind of style. Again, a curveball. Here we have one of the so-called dollars, HK 637A, which is Greene County. This is just south of Pittsburgh. There's not a lot to do in Greene County other than hike. I've been down there. Kind of a quiet place, but it's named after Nathaniel Greene, General Nathaniel Greene of the Revolutionary War. But again, the design is not Warner. It's stylistically somebody in Philadelphia, perhaps, but I don't think it's him, but he was selling it. This one, I don't know exactly what to think of. This is for U.S. Grant, General Grant's monument in Riverside Park in New York, Manhattan, for after he passed. Again, you're getting pretty late now. This is like in the 1897 era, near the end of the heyday of Warner. I'm not sure where to place this one, but it's in his catalog, showing you it. And then we get to the 1901-1902 South Carolina Expo, and this is in Charleston. And you kind of get a feel that maybe that bell, maybe there was a die, maybe that's key. or at least stylistically, this might be coming out of Philadelphia. If you ever go to Charleston, great place to eat, great place to drink. The original site of this expo is right near the Citadel. So if you ever want to see it, the original bandstand from this expo is still there to this day. And it's the park right next door to the Citadel in Charleston. And then finally, one of the last pieces out of the catalog is this piece from the Detroit Bicentennial. And again, that Paquette wreath on the back. So I feel like they must have had a lot of stock of certain types of designs that they kind of concocted into these medals, and probably contracted out the sculpture work to the obverse to Philadephia medalists. And I'll just kind of say in here, I kind of came to this conclusion looking through all these medals of this, but I'm not trying to steal Dick Johnson's thunder, because on his website, he said, as he was dealing in medals, he came to the same sort of similar stylistic opinion that these medals were made in the same place, same way. You know, I don't think that people like engravers in Boston or engravers in New York, like George Hamlin Lovett, I don't think they had a part in these medals. Their medals feel a little bit different. And, you know, Bolin and Merriman, that's all earlier on. So I feel like these medals are the 1880 to 1900 timeframe. And I will say that there is a huge number of medals in the so-called dollar part 2 that I think are attributed, that can be attributed to Warner, based on die marriages, style, and digging, trying to find bits and pieces in researching it. Where I think we don't really have a lot of knowledge is we don't have maker's marks on these. You know, it would be nice if EAK, for example, or whatever the initials may be, could be found on every single one of these and we could tie them more definitively. But I think it's kind of at least nice to sort of, if you're interested in these medals, it's nice to know probably where they were made. The fact that there are connections with the U.S. Mint, George Morgan, like I think it's more beneficial. Well, I mean, when we collect, we want to know what we have. And I think that hopefully this gives some sense that a great many of the medals in the second part of the so-called dollar book are tied to Warner. These are some pages in TAMS that just kind of describe the, how shall we say, 102 medals that were for sale in 1902. And I find it interesting that on this page, you've got Grant at the top, and then, you know, references the Civil War Appomattox Courthouse on the bottom, and Gar. So finishing this out, I think what happened is William Warner must have met with a tragic end at about 1902, because he dropped off the face of the planet, if he ever were even there. I mean, you don't have any pictures of him. All you really have is this medallic work to get a feel for this must have been his work. But somehow the company, they separated, or maybe he passed, and Charles Warner continued on, just like he started in 1860s with his own business. And at about this time, you know, he's getting up there in age. He's getting into his 60s and 70s. He stayed in Philadelphia. He continued to deal in medals. And in 1919, he was, if we had Zoom in 1919, he was at a Pacific Coast Numismatic Society meeting. He was writing letters and communicating with them about what I don't know. But he is mentioned in the PCNS minutes here from 1919. So, and here's his handwriting. And again, you can kind of see if we back up a slide, he was in Mount Vernon Street, 1016. Then either the street was renumbered or he moved to 115 Mount Vernon Street in Philly. And here's an envelope from him with his handwriting at about 1917. Again, I think he passed in like the late 1919 era to the early 1920s to 21. So in summary, you know, the point of this talk was to try to show some fact and some speculation about a great many so-called dollar type metals that came out of the Philadephia era that I think can be tied to Charles Warner and William Warner. I think the metals that are kind of more with those wreaths, not the Paquette wreath, but kind of the simpler metals are probably the work of William Warner. But I think Charles was probably quite the salesman, and he probably had either William or other medalists like Key and Soley. They all worked together to make some pretty impressive collectibles and souvenirs for some of the major expos and smaller fairs between about the 1880 and 1900 time frame. So what could be done in the future? Well, it would be nice to have exact proof that William Warner existed, that he was an engraver, where he trained. Be nice to know more about him, but I haven't been able to find more than what I know now. Hopefully one of the takeaways from this is that there really are quite a large number of historical metals out of Philadephia between 1880 and 1900 that I think trace to the William Warner Company. And interestingly enough, I think that it's interesting, even if you were to collect store cards, anything, engravers from Philly, New York, Boston, Chicago. There are a great many interesting other avenues to look at. And as I go back to the way that I started this talk, as I collect, I collect because I think that the engraving work or the artistry on the metal is nice. I like it. I connect with it. I collect because of a place that I've been. Actually, I was born outside of Philadelphia, but I love Pittsburgh more. Lived there longer. I also think that if you collect metals, it's nice to try to figure out who made it. And I really think that the so-called dollar series, this is where I'm biased, is artistically kind of a fascinating group of metals. I mean, there's over 1,000 in there. I don't think that it's easy to talk about what I talked about tonight unless you have spent time in that series and started to notice the nuances and the connections between a lot of these metals. But I find a great satisfaction in tying metal collecting to US Mint coins. And I imagine this exact same talk could be done by anyone who, for example, loves the San Francisco Mint and looked at who were the engravers in San Francisco and the local area. And all of this could be replicated. It would just take time. So thank you for your attention. I hope this was of interest. I realize it was kind of a metal-rama, tons and tons of metals. But what I want you to take away is it's almost like an art appreciation lecture in terms of seeing some of the, I don't want to say lesser quality engraving, but some of the engraving that's simpler and comparing it against clearly engraving that was, very high stylistically artistry, the kind of things you see on, the Assay Medals, the engraving work on that out of Philadephia in that time frame. So thanks for inviting me to talk and letting me talk. I wish there were more facts that I could give you beyond what I did tonight, but maybe more will come as I continue down in this area. So thanks, and I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was really fascinating. I don't think that those parts of Center City, Philadephia would have been renumbered at all because, as you know, being from near there, they tell you what the cross street is. So they didn't ask for North and South third streets or anything like that. So I think they just moved a lot.
Fires.
Fires, yes, fires, yes. Yeah. Any questions for Robert?
I had a comment. You referenced the 1916, I think it was 1916 PCNS note That comes from the numismatist, of course, where they would send a summary pretty much each month. But there are minutes. I guess it's a question for Dan. Are the PCNS minutes from that year available? That would presumably have much more detail about what that correspondence was.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you send me an email, I will check the archives and see. Was it 1916 or 1919?
1919.
It was
1919. That's what I wrote down. Okay. So if you send me an email, I'll take a look in the archives and see if there's more detail about that meeting, or maybe even before that or after that, commenting about his
That'd be
presentation.
really cool. I will.
That would be really cool.
The numismatist was usually by month too, so you could send them the month and the year.
Well, they even told you the number of the meeting. So
Yeah, they were kind of low numbers.
yeah, it was only the first 5 years. Any other questions?
I'd like to make a comment. Robert, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. That was really nice to see the so-called dollar that had the veiled prophet ball. That was some attempt at high society balls there that went on for years and years and years. I didn't know there was something like that. Thank you.
Welcome.
Cool. Anything else?
Bob, did you find any evidence that Warner was involved with the A&A at all?
No. In terms of what I was using to try to dig this up, I mean, this all started because John gave a talk about denticles and William Warner in 17. And most of us, I kind of thought it was wonderful, but I don't know, it was kind of a little bit complicated. But he and I have talked about this like probably every few months ever since then, because I thought it was just the mind of a genius, But no, I haven't found a whole lot. I have to just suspect that Charles Warner was involved in everything in Philadelphia. I mean, that there's no question. He was the brains. I mean, I even kind of one night thought, does William Warner even exist?
Right.
But clearly Charles was not engraving. So, I imagine he was behind, this was his company, and I don't know. I mean, it's great. It's just like kind of, to pick another, flavorful character, Jeff Shevlin is, striking metals from dies, and he's selling. He's not engraving, but there's certainly people, in Loveland, Colorado, who can stamp the things out, and it's awesome. I think and I will say this, it's fun to be in a hobby where, like, I sometimes like to collect restrikes because they're rarer and more interesting, not the stuff from China necessarily, but understanding like what's real and what's not real, and die varieties and metal varieties. It just goes on and on and on. And it's exciting to sort of theorize, where things came from and who made them, and really appreciate the artistry. And it's been an amazing 10 years of collecting in this arena. And I find myself, interestingly enough, at some nights I want to kind of go towards the collecting or spending money on the higher artistry engraving. And then every once in a while I'll see something very simple and appreciate it for what it is and want that.
Okay.
Did you find any obituaries for either one of the Warners?
That's a great question. I will tell you, I do think I found an obit. I did not find for sure in newspapers.com an obit for William Warner, but I believe, and again, you have to bear with me because I'm getting old. I'm pretty sure I ran across what I think was Charles Warner's obit, and I want to say it was as late as 1926.
Okay.
I just have one comment to Michael McDaniel. Working on the so-called dollar book in the expositions and writing intros for the different expositions, I actually know what the veiled prophet ball is. And that's just something that's just way out there.
Yeah, it's some old mysticism, and it's tied into something with the stuff happening down the river in New Orleans too, I think. So, Mardi Gras and stuff.
That. No, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, yeah. I can look him up on Legacy, both Warner Brothers, and see what I can find. The trouble is, it's not an uncommon name, but I mean, I have an all access account, so I can look up anything I want. So I'll see what I can find, and I'll let
And
you know.
there's another issue at the same time. There's another Charles Warner in Philadelphia who's working with his father, who's also a jeweler like the other Warners were. So you have to, as you're tracing somebody, you have to go, wait a minute, which Charles am I looking at?